A really warm thanks to Reflex for sponsoring this video. The most significant change to the iPhone 16 Pro this year for photographers is completely undisclosed by Apple, which is a little bit baffling. And I know it's the most significant change because I put it to the test in this video. Welcome back, everyone. I'm a full-time landscape photographer who's lived on the road for over 3 years, living and breathing landscape photography, making videos like the one you're watching right now, where I compare the newest iPhone to my daily professional camera, the Canon R5, in real-world situations like the one you see behind me. Last year's iPhone 15 Pro had pretty lackluster results in comparison to its predecessor. This year is a bit different though, and the iPhone 16 Pro has a lot to talk about. There's a new sensor on the ultra-wide camera, there's a camera control button, and what I think is the biggest update is the ability to take insanely high-quality RAW images at a fraction of the size. So we're going to put that ultra-wide sensor to the test in both a macro and landscape style image. We're going to take some images using the main camera during sunset and blue hour, and most importantly, I get to show you how insane the new compression methods are for those raw images. And if you stick around to the end, I even have some Aurora photos to show you that I took on the iPhone 16 Pro. So sit back, relax, and join me along for the ride in one of the most beautiful places in the world, fall in the San Juan Mountains of Colorado.
Darling, you're with me, always around me. Only love, darling, I feel you under my body. Only love, only love.
All right, so the biggest upgrade this year is going to be that ultra-wide camera, so that's going to be the first test we do. We're out here in the San Juan Mountains of Colorado. It is absolutely beautiful. I'm shooting on the Canon R5 at 14mm on my RF 14-35, and I'm shooting at basically 13mm on both the 16 Pro and 15 Pro. Now the 15 Pro still has that old 12 megapixel sensor. The new 16 Pro has that 48 megapixel sensor that's used on the main camera, and that's what we're mainly testing in this comparison. It's a lot harder this year. Every other year I've been able to mount my phone up top and just take the same image that way, but because the image is so wide, if I put the camera back here, you just see the lens. So what I have to do is hold both of the cameras, or both of the phones on top of the camera, set a 10-second timer on this camera, and then take the image. Now, if you've never seen my videos before, this one is going to be the same as always. It's going to be a blind test. So I'm going to show you all three cameras, A, B, and C. The cameras are not going to be the same every single time. So for this test, camera A could be the Canon, and then the next test, camera B could be the Canon. So it'll be mixed up depending on the test. Then I'm going to give you the results at the end of the video. And it's kind of this fun thing to do where you follow along and try to guess which one is which. Secondly, I'm going to be shooting in RAW on all of my cameras. RAW always on my Canon R5, but more specifically, RAW on both the iPhone 15 Pro and 16 Pro. The biggest difference this year is the iPhone 16 Pro actually has different compression methods for its RAW, which we're going to get to a little bit later, but we're not going to dive into it right now. Just know that I'm basically taking every image on every device in the best possible way I can. The most data I can possibly get out of each image, and that's going to give us the fairest comparison between each camera. Then at the end, I'm going to edit everything together and show you the results. One other key thing about this shoot tonight is that there's quite a few photographers in my shot. One of the downsides of shooting so wide is a lot of the times you're almost shooting too much. So another thing that's going to be a test here is I'm going to have to Photoshop out those people. So I will get to test how good I can Photoshop things on that 48 megapixel sensor or on the 16 Pro. We're gonna have to do the same on the 15 Pro as well, so you'll get to see those results. And usually the more data you have to work with, bigger sensor, bigger megapixels, the better you can Photoshop things out. One really important thing that I failed to mention about this is the actual composition and how challenging it is for all of the cameras. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to kind of create an image that captures this iconic spot here in the San Juans, but also because it's so wide, it's really tough to compose an image at that focal length. So what I did is I have this sea of aspen leaves that are on the bottom, and I have a bunch of aspen trees that will test how well the distortion is depending on where the framing is in the image. And then right in the center of the frame, you have that nice true grit cathedral rock that's really famous here in the San Juans. But in terms of the light, it's really technical. The dynamic range was really high to the point where I was even blowing out my highlights here that I know that I can recover on my R5, and we're really pushing the limits of what a camera sensor can do. So I'll be curious to see how well both the 16 and the 15 Pro handle it. There's a lot going on in this, and if it gets a lot of the detail and a lot of the light, I will be truly impressed.
Give me shelter, or show me heart. Come on love, watch me fall apart, watch me fall apart. And I'll be yours always around me. Only love, darling, I feel you under my body.
Another spectacular sunset here in the San Juan Mountains. It doesn't get much better than this. And I know I said I was going to be focusing on the ultra-wide sensor. However, I wanted to do at least one test comparing the main sensor on the 16 Pro to the Canon camera, which I've done every year. I actually took this shot 2 years ago when the 14 Pro came out. And what better way to test that to see if there's been any changes between the 14 Pro, the 15 Pro, or the 16 Pro than try to take the same shot that I took 2 years ago. The light was not like this when I took the shot. It was actually far more dynamic and a little bit more challenging, but there was more light in the image. We had a lot of light on the foreground down here, wrapping around to these trees back here, and on the mountain back there, but there was definitely some nice shadows over here. So it's really gonna push the limits of both my Canon R5 and the 16 Pro, just to see how well it's gonna look. The second thing I was doing is using a polarizer. So you can tell I have this little clip on here that's made by Maven, and that means that I can use all of my filters that I have for my main camera, like this one, and stick it right on to the camera for my phone pretty easily. The reason I'm doing this is because before there's a lot of haze in the sky and there hasn't been a lot of clouds or moisture in the atmosphere, although today we've got a lot of clouds, which makes the image a lot better. But what that means is there's going to be way more haze in the atmosphere. So I'm using a polarizer to cut that out. And you're going to watch me use the polarizer on the lens, take the image, move the polarizer up to my phone here, and take the same image. The last thing I'm going to do is I'm waiting till blue hour right now, and I'm going to take a much less light image. And that's usually where these cameras tend to fall apart. But I want to see if the 16 Pro algorithms or anything of that nature ends up looking better on the 16 Pro. So I'm actually going to present two images to you. I'm going to show you the one that I took when all the light was happening, all the dynamics, and I'm going to show you a blue hour shot, and you can try to guess which one was which. Canon R5, iPhone 16 Pro.
Darling, you with me, always around me. Only love, darling, I feel you under my body. Only love, give me shelter. Oh, show me heart. Come on, love, watch me fall apart. Watch me fall apart.
This year, Apple finally added 120 FPS 4K recording, which I've used exclusively to film today's sponsor, Reflex. If you're someone who shoots photography on your phone, Reflex is an absolutely great app that I've covered before right here on this channel. They're more than just an app though, and offer a wide range of lenses and accessories to expand the possibilities you have within your phone photography. They've recently launched a campaign for their first ever telephoto lens designed exclusively for the 5x telephoto lens on both the iPhone 16 and 15 Pro Max. That's also compatible with other numerous flagship phones on the market. They sent me over a pre-production model that I've been using over the last several weeks, and that extra reach the lens has provided has been crucial for the shots that needed the extra distance. The lens doubles the 5x camera's focal length from 120 to 240 millimeters and provides sharp, detailed images as if you're shooting with the native phone lenses, which has been quite impressive in my testing. The images you're seeing wouldn't be possible without this reach. If you're someone who wants to capture wildlife, your kids' sporting events, or just get that extra distance you've missed, then this is absolutely the lens to get. They work flawlessly with Reflex's standard 17mm Pro Series phone cases. They're small enough so you can pocket and have them with you all the time, and have genuinely impressive image quality that will elevate your phone photography. Using my link in the description helps support this channel while also securing yourself up to 40% off with early bird pricing during their launch campaign. Thank you again to Reflex. Now let's get back to what I believe is the most important update to the iPhone this year. So every year when I make my iPhone comparison videos, I'm out here taking real world shots. These are not studio shots or just random things that I'm finding just to compare the phones. I'm out here trying to take images for my portfolio in my landscape photography profession, and then trying to take images that I'm taking with my camera with my phone. I think this is the most representative of, can my phone match my camera? And what better way to represent the real world than coming back to this spot that's over here that I've come to every year. I come to the San Juans, and it is not the same anymore. What I mean by that is, you can see this tree here. Well, in the years past, it's been one of my favorite compositions to shoot for sunset. I've had rainbows, I've had different kind of cloud formations, I've had all kinds of conditions, but the tree is like the center of the frame with these nice aspens on the right-hand side and the left-hand side and the mountain range in the back. And now that the dead tree is, well, it's looking pretty sad, the shot doesn't work anymore, or at least not for this particular composition. So instead of comparing the full-fledged camera to the iPhone 16 Pro, I'm going to do the JPEG-XL compression comparison. I talked about this earlier in the intro, and I mentioned the RAW compression at the very first shoot that we did. What JPEG-XL is basically when you shoot RAW images currently on your 14 Pro or 15 Pro with that 48 megapixel sensor, the RAW file sizes are huge. They're 75 to almost 100 megabytes each, meaning you really can't shoot often in RAW. You really have to be very deliberate about when you shoot RAW. I don't shoot it very often. I have probably less than 100 photos in RAW on both of my phone cameras. However, this year they've added a different compression method for the iPhone 16 Pro, and they've given us 3 different compression options. There's JPEG-XL most compatible, there's JPEG-XL lossless, and JPEG-XL lossy. Now, I'm not an expertise on these subjects, so I couldn't tell you exactly what is going on here, but what I can tell you is the layman term, is that the most compatible is going to be the biggest file sizes. That's what I'm using throughout this video just to give us the most data, because I haven't done the test for this yet. The other 2 compression methods will reduce the file size by about half or almost a fourth, and it said that we won't lose any detail. Now, I have never tested this in the iPhone, so as I'm recording this, I don't know how true this is. So what I'm going to do is I've taken the 3 images on here, and I'm going to compare them right now so you can see if there's any loss. And if there's not much data loss between the uncompressed version and the compressed version, that is a game changer, especially for photographers, but even for people that aren't photographers that just want to take high quality images that they can edit and save some space. So let's do the comparison right now and see if there's any data loss between the compressed version and the non-compressed versions.
All right, so normally this is where I'd play some music and show you all the images side by side, but the truth is you're not going to be able to see the difference even zoomed into 100% for these images. So stick around to the comparison where I can show you just how wild these results are even at 800%, and I'll even be providing these images for you to download to see for yourself.
All right, so the last comparison I wanted to do for this video was the macro capabilities of the ultra-wide considering that new sensor. The problem is my 14-35 on my Canon there has a minimum focusing distance of about 200 millimeters, whereas the phones have a minimum focusing distance of 20 millimeters, meaning I have to keep my Canon camera back pretty far at 14 millimeters to get focus, whereas both the 15 Pro and 16 Pro can get almost right up on the subject for their macro capabilities. So instead of doing that, I just kind of manufactured the scene that I had in mind, because a few years ago, I think it was when I was doing the 13 Pro video, I took an image of a wet aspen leaf for a macro, and it blew me away in terms of the results back then. I believe that's when they introduced the macro capabilities on the iPhone. So I wanted to recreate that. The only problem is there's been no precipitation. So I took a few shots without water, I took a few shots with water, and I just kind of put some leaves on this log to create some separation between the background and the foreground. That way we're getting a bit of being able to tell which one the camera might be or the phone might be, because one of those could be a little bit more out of focus than the other or have some fall off. However, I did take my images at f16 on this camera to give the best possible representation of what I would probably do in real life. The other thing you're going to notice is it's sitting on a tripod, but that was only to set up the shot, frame my shot, and then repeat it on all 3 cameras. I actually ended up taking the camera off the tripod and shooting the leaves so that it gave the best comparison between the 3 cameras, because I thought it would be unfair to have my camera on the tripod and hand hold both phones. That wouldn't be realistic. So what I did is I boosted the ISO up on my camera, made sure my shutter speed was sharp enough so that the comparison is more real. So that is going to be this comparison. I did take an image on the 16 Pro that was super macro, getting like extremely close. We're talking like, well, exactly 20 millimeters probably, just to show you the capabilities of how close you can actually get. But as much as this is not technically the macro comparison because it wasn't in macro mode on the phones, you still get a lot of detail on this log and in the leaves and the reflections of the water. So I'd be very interested to see how these images are going to compare. The last thing to keep in mind is I always edit my Canon images first. That's the most genuine. I want to do everything I would normally do to that image and then see if the phones can match it. Otherwise, if I'm just editing the phone photo and then trying to match the camera, that doesn't seem like a fair comparison. I want the phones to try to match this just to see how good they are. So we're going to jump in now and you're going to get to see all the results, but here are the images here. Can you pick out which one is the camera and can you pick out which ones are the phone?
Under the moon, I'm watching you sleep, I'm driving you home in the night. Coriander and the dress that you wore and the way that we danced in the light. Oh, oh, you and I under the stars.
All right, so we've taken all our images and now it's time to dive into the results. And they are pretty interesting this year. We did the 2 tests of that new ultra-wide sensor, but both results show different stories. You're gonna have to stick around for both of them. However, I really wanna focus on those JPEG-XL compressions. So we're gonna go a little bit out of order here, but we're gonna start with one of the wide angle images. So let's start off by telling you the results. Camera A was the 16 Pro, camera B was the 15 Pro, and camera C was the R5. For these comparisons, I'm going to be comparing the 16 Pro to the R5, and then we'll take a look at the 15 Pro. So here are our 2 images. The first thing to notice is that typically on wide angle or ultra wide angle shots, the center of the frame is sharper than the edges of the frame. That's something that a lot of photographers test, especially when it comes to lens sharpness. So let's take a look at the center of the frame. We're already zoomed in to about 150% here. And you're going to notice that the R5 image, which is on the right, is definitely sharper. The details in the trees are all there on the R5, and they're definitely a little bit mushy on the 16 Pro. This is not the same results as I typically get on the main camera of the iPhones in the last couple of years, which you're going to see soon. But I do want to say that the results here are pretty good, and I do think that I could have pushed the sharpening a little bit more on the 16 Pro, but still the data and the details are not nearly as there as they are on the main sensor when we compare those. Something that's interesting though is as we get further down, I'm going to go slowly, and you're going to notice as we get to the edge of the frame, things are going to get a little bit more blurry as we go. The details here are become less and less as we get closer to the edges of the frame, and I think it's actually being caused by the lens on the iPhone, not necessarily the sensor, which you'll see in a second. So here's the edge of the frame, and let's check out the edge of the frame over here as well. What you're going to notice is that the tree looks okay. Yes, it's definitely a little bit blurrier and lacks some detail, but what you're really going to notice is the foliage here and how different these are. The other thing to point out is that these are the images that I photoshopped, so I removed all those people over here, and I also removed the car that's over here, and all the cameras did a pretty good job, or the results are pretty good based off each camera. I would say these results are passable, but I probably wouldn't be able to print these images super large. Now, let's take a look at the 16 Pro versus the 15 Pro. I'm going to try to always keep the 16 Pro on the left-hand side. So let's zoom into the center of the frame like we did before. Something else to note is that these 15 Pro images you're seeing are always double the zoom rate. So when I zoom into 100%, it's actually 200%. And that's how it was throughout the video. That's just because it's a 12 megapixel sensor versus the 48 megapixels we get out of the R5 and the 16 Pro. You're going to notice that the 15 Pro is much sharper and definitely lacks more detail. I actually think there's a lot more room to play with the 16 Pro here. And I think there's a substantial difference between these 2 images at the center of the frame. Where the story gets interesting is if we do the same thing we did last time and we move to the edges of the frame, you really start to lose a lot of the difference in detail here. Something to keep in mind here is that this is also the shadow area, which is typically where the phones do worse. Usually where the best they are is, well, in this particular image, the center of the frame where there's the most light. And as you move to darker areas, the phone images tend to degrade with the darker it gets. However, what's interesting is that on all the edges of the frame here, I really can't notice a huge detail difference in the 16 Pro versus the 15 Pro. If anything, that extra sharpening that's going on in the 15 Pro is giving me slightly better results here. Now, if we zoom into maybe 200, 300%, you're going to notice that there's not a whole lot of difference between these. If anything, the 15 Pro is sharper because it's just overly sharpened in comparison. But in terms of the detail, when we look on the edges of the frame here, it's a night and day difference compared to the center of the frame, which is here. And I think this is because the lenses on the iPhone just don't have very sharp edges. all of the sharpness is in the center of the frame. So no matter what, regardless of what sensor you're shooting on, if the edges get blurry, you're going to have a blurry image on the edge. So that's comparing those wide angle images. Now let's take a look at that JPEG-XL compression. This to me is the most exciting thing from this year's results. I'm going to change the loop overview here so you're going to be able to see. On the left-hand side, I'm going to try to keep that biggest file, 78 megabytes. That's the exact file size of this actual image. On the right-hand side, I'm going to show you both JPEG-XL compressions, the lossless and the lossy. Another thing to keep in mind here is that I did edit these images and then I applied it to each image. I just copied and pasted it. Sometimes in the raw image, you can't actually see detail difference until you start editing, and then you can start to notice where the compression is going to affect your image. And like I said, if we zoom into this image, even at 300%, it's really hard to see a difference. So let's go to 600% here, and you're going to start to see that maybe, and in my opinion, from what I'm seeing on my screen, the JPEG-XL lossless, which is about almost half the size, actually has more detail and looks a little bit better. Now, I know you're not going to be able to see this on your screen because I'm compressing when I'm screen recording, I'm compressing on YouTube. So I'm actually going to have a link down below the like button where you can download all three of these files and you can look at them side by side and compare them yourself just to see how strong these compressions are, and probably be blown away like I was. So in my opinion, when I zoom in super close here, I actually think the JPEG-XL lossless image looks better than the JPEG image. And it's, again, almost half the size. Where the story gets even more interesting is when we look at that one that's a fourth of the size. So let's do that really quick. All right, just as before, I have the largest file size on the left and the smallest file size now on the right. And you're going to notice this one's only 21 megabytes. So just keep in mind that one of these is almost 80 megabytes. One of these is 21 megabytes. And again, I guarantee you're not going to be able to see it on YouTube, but I'm going to show it to you anyways. And again, you can download it down below. But I've gone through this whole image looking everywhere for different signs of artifacting or anything like that. I've increased the exposure by 2 stops. I've decreased the exposure by 2 stops to see if there's anything in the highlights or the shadows. And genuinely, I can't see a difference. If anything, I actually think the JPEG-XL lossy version here is probably just 1%, 0.5% better than our full-fledged 80 megabyte file. That's what blew me away. I don't understand why this is not talked about on Apple's website. It's literally nowhere. It's not in the keynote. If you control F JPEG-XL on the 16 Pro write-up, it's non-existent. It's nowhere. Now, I know that this isn't going to sell cameras, but to me, this was a amazing feat of this camera. And I actually think it's going to change photography on your phones because you're going to be able to shoot in RAW way more often and not worry about the file sizes. This is a big deal. I think this is a huge deal, and I actually am really looking forward to it happening on some of my cameras as well, because that's going to save files down the road. And I just think that this blew me away, just seeing the compression methods, because I'm always kind of skeptical. I'm like, oh, I can see a little bit of a difference. I can't see a difference here, and I would love to know if you can. So download them. Let me know in the comments what you think. I was blown away. All right, so next up is the main camera sensor test. I didn't want to put a lot of time and effort into this one because I don't think the sensor has changed that much over the last couple of years. 14 Pro, 15 Pro, and now the 16 Pro, they all have pretty similar results. However, the results are still pretty amazing. So on the left-hand side, we have the 16 Pro. On the right-hand side, we have the R5. Let's zoom into the center of the frame to about 150%. And this is where I still am blown away by the results. To me, these images are very similar, especially in the lighted areas of the image. Remember how I said the brighter, the better for the iPhones, and that typically in the shadows, they get a little bit worse? Well, you can really see it here. I would be happy to print either of these images, and I do a print test every year that you can check out here, and I've done this. I have printed basically this exact image pretty large and seen if anyone can tell the difference, even the nightscape image. And a lot of people can't tell the difference, even printed large. So just take my word for it. This image is pretty dang good. And if we even move down here to the shadows, there's actually still a decent amount of detail here in the forestry, on the aspens, and down here in the shadows of these trees. And if we move over here to the light here, there's still a lot of sharpness, a lot of detail in the trees. It's not as good as the R5, but man, is it close. And the last thing I want to show is just how detailed some of the leaves down here are. And to me, this particular side-by-side, these look very, very similar. As always, very impressive, still impressed by this, and I think the results speak for themselves. And in the next test where the phone kind of falls apart is in the low light, which you're going to be able to see here. Maybe when we're zoomed out here, they look pretty good, but as soon as we zoom into the center of the frame like we did last time, you can really tell that the details are not there. And that's what I was talking about before. The lower the light, the worse that quad bear sensor is going to be able to render or do its mathematical stuff, computational stuff, and provide a better image. You can really tell that this result is pretty mushy. I would be surprised if many of you watching didn't get this correct when you were watching after I zoomed in. And when you get to the shadow areas, it's even worse. And there's way more detail in the R5 image here in the shadows. And even on the areas that were lit, it's not looking too great. All right, so the results of this one were the sunset test, camera A was the R5, camera B was the 16 Pro, and in the low light test, camera A was the R5 and camera B was the 16 Pro, so they were the same. But those are the results of the main camera sensor. Let's talk about the ultra wide one more time. All right, so for the macro test results, camera A was the 15 Pro, camera B was the R5, and camera C was the 16 Pro. Also, if you hear birds in the background, sorry, I live in my car. This is the only option I have for getting this recorded. So again, 16 Pro on the left, R5 on the right. And just stay tuned because this tells a slightly different story about that ultra wide than the first image did. If I zoom into the center of the frame, even at about 200%, we're at 160. Let's just get us a little closer. You can notice that the details in the 16 Pro are actually really good. Now, maybe there's not as sharp, they're not as clear as the R5, which is kind of to be expected. However, I think I could also just run this through Topaz or add a little bit more sharpening and probably resolve a lot of this in the iPhone image. The story that gets interesting though is that when you look at the edges of the frame like we did before, the fall off here is not nearly as much. And I think that's because of the distance from all of the subject matter. Whereas before we were taking a giant landscape image and there was a lot of distortion on the left and right or top and bottom of the frame. Whereas here we're so close to everything that the distortion and details of the distortion are not nearly as severe, especially on the left-hand side of the frame. Or even if we go down here to the bottom of the tree, you're going to notice that there's obviously more detail in the R5 image, but it's not nearly as different or egregious as it was in the first image. Where things get interesting though is when we compare the 15 Pro to the 16 Pro. And remember, when I zoom into 200%, that's actually 400% on the 15 Pro. So we're going to zoom into that same center image. You're going to notice the 15 Pro is definitely more sharpened, but there's still a lot of detail there overall. And actually in the highlight areas here, it seems to be a little bit more recovered than in the iPhone 16 Pro. And the weird thing about this comparison is, yes, it is more sharp, and yes, there's probably slightly less detail there, but they're not nearly as far off as the first image was. Even at the center of the frame, I actually can't notice a ton of difference. Now, I do think that I could probably sharpen the iPhone 16 Pro and print it larger because there is a little bit more detail there. And I would love to know if you can see the difference between these two. Obviously, I think you'll be able to see the sharpening difference, but there's still a lot of detail here in the 15 Pro image, even though it's only a 12 megapixel sensor. This surprised me, and it obviously told me a different story than that first result. And it has something to do with, I think, how far you are away from your subject and how it's rendering things or doing its computation in the 16 Pro, especially using that lens and having the distortion be different. This was telling, and I think it tells me that, you know, the 15 Pro is still pretty good for what it's doing, even though it has that older sensor. Okay, so those are the results. Did anything surprise you, especially that JPEG-XL comparison? I would love to know in the comments down below. Now, a few other things that are new on the camera this year are things like the camera control button and the photographic styles that are added to the 16 Pro. But the reality is, I didn't really use them. I am going to reserve my judgment because I think it's important to know that the style of images I'm shooting, whether it's on a tripod or I'm holding both cameras like this, don't really allow me to use that little button that's on the top very naturally. When I'm on a tripod, I actually want to tap the screen to take the image. That's actually what I do on my bigger cameras when I'm shooting photography. That instills less camera shake on a tripod. So I don't have a good opinion of the control button yet. I think overall, it probably has a few features that I probably will never use, like zooming and stuff like that. However, when it comes to the photographic styles, I recently did this video on the Fuji X100VI, and that whole video is about shooting images and adding styles to them without having to edit them. So if Apple can take the photographic styles that they have now and kind of allow people to build more recipes, build more looks with them, and then use the control button that's at the top to quickly go through those different recipes, I could really see those being super useful even for someone like me. The other thing to remember is I'm not a normal shooter. I'm someone that's shooting a lot of very deliberate images, and I could easily see many people out there taking their cameras out and using that button pretty often, unlike maybe I would. So I'm still reserving judgment. I still think there's more room to improve there, and that's another thing that's very interesting about the release this year is Apple kind of released an unfinished phone, and I'm pretty sure Steve Jobs would be rolling in his grave if he knew that, but most of the features that they hyped up aren't even on the phone. Like for example, the half shutter press for the camera button, like your normal cameras do, isn't even enabled yet on that camera control. All the AI stuff, not there. However, there was still a lot of stuff to talk about, and I actually was more impressed this year by the upgrades than I was last year. I don't think there was very many at all last year that mattered to most people when it came to photography, but I did want to mention that, and I wanted to mention the camera control button because that is what they're using to sell the phone, not JPEG-XL compression. I have to understand that. However, I do think that they could have talked about it more because I really do think it's a big deal. All right, lastly, really quick, I did promise you some Aurora photos, but again, these are mostly for fun. This is not meant to be a comparison. So on the left, I have my iPhone 16 Pro. On the right, I have my R7 with my 18-35 Sigma. That's a 1.8. It's actually what I'm filming on right now, which lets in a lot of light for nightscape photography. And, you know, I could sit here and zoom in and show you that the details are not going to be there in the shadows, or that there's so much noise reduction that a lot of the stars even get hurt by the iPhone image. But at the end of the day, I don't really think that what this is for is that. I think that it's amazing that I can take Aurora images here in Colorado during these crazy magnetic storms on my phone and be able to share them with friends or family. Now, the thing is, we're not at a point where I could print these and compare them to my full-fledged camera. As you can tell here, the details are just not there yet. But what I do think is there is fun. And I think it's really, really cool that we can take our phones out and I can take an image like the one on the left. Also, a quick pro tip is if you're ever out hunting for the Aurora, use your phone to find it. A lot of the times I'll notice barely just a little bit going on, and I'll take my phone out and my phone will actually see better than my eyes can. So if you ever go out shooting the Aurora, especially this next coming year when the storms are supposed to be just as crazy, take out your phone and look for it that way. I just think this is so awesome. Here's one more comparison. Not that it's a comparison. On the left, 16 Pro. On the right is in my R5, completely unedited image. And one thing I wanted to point out is on the right, this is no noise reduction. So if you've never shot Astro before, especially on a camera, a lot of the times you have to apply noise reduction. You can see all this noise on the right-hand side. But when you take those images on your phone, the noise reduction is already applied. It's already there. That's why it already looks pretty good, because it does all of that immediately. Also to note is this is all using the main camera, the ultra wide, not great for nightscape photography. And secondly, I also had these on a tripod, so I was not hand holding these, but you can hand hold them to pretty good results. Anyways, I just thought this was really cool and I wanted to show them to you. And I hope that maybe you captured a few on your phone in the last year during these crazy storms. All right, so those Aurora photos are going to wrap up this video. I hope you enjoyed this. And if you really did, hit the like button or consider subscribing, and I'll see you on the next one. There's got to be a Aurora photo somewhere. We just got to go find it. Later.